Hello everybody and welcome to a beginner's guide to dragonflies and damselflies. My name is James, I'm a Learning and Engagement Officer with Sussex Wildlife Trust, and once again I'm going to be your guide today. Now welcome to part 3, and in this part we're going to be looking at just under half of the dragonfly species that you're most likely to find in Sussex. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the more common species and those that are a little bit more abundant. Okay folks, so let's begin, and what we're going to do is we're going to start off by looking at the king of dragonflies, which is the emperor. Now, of the 3 emperor species in the UK, by far and away the most likely one that you will see is this one, which is just known as the Emperor Dragonfly. So you can see here it has this beautiful bright apple green thorax with a lovely blue abdomen in the case of the male. Now both sexes have this long brown line running all the way down the abdomen, although the female's body is pretty much green overall. Now they also have this very prominent front wing vein, this bright yellow wing vein. Now if you cast your mind back to part 2, you'll remember that was called the costa. Now in this example here, this is a female emperor dragonfly who's ovipositing, laying her eggs in vegetation just below the water's surface. Now she is a rather tatty example, but you can see she still has that bright apple green thorax and the long line running down her abdomen. Now the Emperor Dragonfly, it really is the UK's largest dragonfly species. So they can reach up to about 8.5 centimetres long, and the wingspan can be about 12 to 13 centimetres. Now, these are also a very early flying species. To be honest, if you see a large, colourful, almost ceaseless dragonfly from round about mid to late spring, it's very, very likely to be an emperor dragonfly. Now, this is a very territorial species. In fact, it's probably the one that you're most likely to see engaged in aerial combat. So often you'll even hear the clashes of their wings as they collide in battle. It really is a fantastic spectacle. Now these dragonflies, they hunt on the wing and they hunt large prey, including other dragonflies and butterflies and such like. Now most of the time they will actually eat these on the wing, but very occasionally they might need to land to deal with larger prey. Now, as I mentioned, they have this beautiful bright apple green thorax, unmarked as well. They have this very prominent yellow wing vein, the costa. Now, they also, both sexes have this brownish line that runs all the way down the abdomen, and they have these lovely green-blue eyes. Now, this really is a dragonfly that tends to be found around lakes and ponds, but generally they certainly have a preference for slower flowing water. Okay everybody, so now I'd like to move on to the first of our commoner hawker dragonfly species, the southern hawker. Now this is a very attractive species, a beautiful blue and green male here seen perched high up in an oak tree. Now if you look just behind the head, you can see these 2 really distinctive blotches of colour on the thorax. And if you look down towards the end of the abdomen, you can see where the paired dots have become banded, both of which are very, very diagnostic in this dragonfly. Now, the southern hawker really is a species that lives up to its name. So this is a common species across the south of England and across Sussex. Funnily enough, its distribution elsewhere, particularly in the north of the country, is rather more localised. Now, the southern hawker is such an inquisitive species. The chances are if you see a large blue and green dragonfly and it comes to investigate you, it's very likely to be a male of this species. I love the southern hawker because it is so curious. Now, although this is a dragonfly that tends to inhabit ponds and lakes and slower flowing waters, the adults tend to spend a lot of time away from water hawking for insects. So you'll often see these dragonflies within woodland and along open woodland rides. Now, if it's a warm summer's evening, you may well see these dragonflies flying all the way to dusk. They will eventually perch, so try and keep your eyes on them and hopefully that should allow for a good look. Now, as I mentioned, they have these two very prominent blotches of colour on top of the thorax, really, really distinctive, and the dots at the end of the abdomen are also banded, both very diagnostic. Now, the wing veins and the wing spots are both pretty dark on this species. Now, you may have noticed in the previous video that they looked rather light, but I'll be honest, that was just because the light was shining through the wings from above. Now, the last feature that I would try and look out for are these very prominent green stripes on the side of the thorax. They are really distinctive, and you may even see this on the dragonfly in flight, so do keep your eyes open for it. Okay, so now I'd like to move on to the migrant hawker. And the migrant hawker is also well established in the south of England. So this is a species that breeds in the south, breeds in Sussex, but is rather more migratory elsewhere. Having said that, we do tend to see rather large autumnal influxes of this species. So you may well see many around at this time of the year. Now, this is a species that is later flying than the southern hawker. So whereas the southern hawkers are very much a species of summer and early autumn, the migrant hawker may be seen all the way into November. This is very much a species of late autumn. Now, I would say that this dragonfly has more of a tendency to hover than the majority of the other hawkers. So in fact, it's probably the one hawker that often gives some fantastic photographic opportunities. Now, in comparison to the southern hawker, it has these tiny little shoulder stripes. They are almost non-existent compared to the big green blotches that the southern hawker has. Now, looking at the abdomen, you'll see that the dots are paired all the way until the tip. Now, of course, this is very different from the southern hawker, where those final three segments had banded dots. Now, if you're looking at this dragonfly in flight, you may well notice that the stripes on the thorax are rather thinner than they are on the southern hawker. This is really distinctive, and it gives the thorax an overall more uniform look when the dragonfly is in flight. Now, when they are flying, they also have this tendency to hold their abdomen up. They tilt it up. This is very different from the southern hawkers, which tend to hold their abdomen out straight. So if you see a colourful dragonfly and it seems to have an up-tilted abdomen, it's very likely that it may be a migrant hawker. Now let's just take a look at these two species side by side, look at some of the main features to help you identify one from another. Now, I didn't cover this in the individual species accounts, but the patterning in segment 2 of the abdomen is rather different. So you can see in the migrant hawker, it has this somewhat arched green triangle, which actually is a little bit more like a golf tee or a spinning top. In the southern hawker, you can see it's a relatively straight green triangle, so rather different. Now, looking onto the top of the thorax, you can see in the migrant hawker, it has these tiny little shoulder stripes. They are barely noticeable in comparison to the big green blotches exhibited by the southern hawker. Now, if we move on to the abdomen, you can see on the migrant hawker, it has these paired dots all the way down to the tip. Now, of course, the southern hawker had the last three pairs of dots banded, so very, very distinctive indeed. Now, I should say that the males of both of these species are largely blue and green, but whereas the females exhibit similar patterning, their coloration is largely green only. Unfortunately, you can't really split these dragonflies by habitual preference because the adults of both species spend a lot of time away from water, hawking for insects and perching amongst hedgerows and amongst open woodland. So the last of the hawkers I'd like to cover is the brown hawker. Now the brown hawker really does live up to its name. It really couldn't be any browner. The body, the wings, the eyes, every single part of this dragonfly is brown in coloration. Very, very distinctive indeed. Now, The brown hawker is a really large species, like many of the other hawker dragonflies. It's a very powerful flyer, and it also has a very distinctive flight characteristic. Now, it tends to intersperse bouts of furious wing beats with longer bouts of gliding, something that is quite distinctive when you see it fly. Now, it's a ceaselessly active species. The brown hawker almost never seems to stop. If you get an opportunity to photograph a perching brown hawker, I really suggest you take it because it might not happen again for quite a while. Now, of course, these golden brown wings are very distinctive when the dragonfly is perched, but they're also very distinctive when it's flying. So in fact, it's going to be one of the most prominent features on this dragonfly when you see it in flight. Like many of the other hawkers, it's often found well away from water. They tend to have a preference for slower moving water bodies. They really are a lowland dragonfly species, but you will also see them hawking for insects along hedgerows and along the edges of woodland. Now, the males are not at all aggressive to each other. This is quite unusual, and it often can result in these big aggregations of brown hawkers all hawking for prey at the same time. This really can be a fantastic spectacle to behold. Now, they don't have any shoulder stripes at all, which is really quite unusual amongst the hawker dragonflies. They do, however, have these small yellow stripes on the side of the thorax, but the brown coloration is so distinctive that you probably won't even need to notice these yellow stripes. Right, so we're now going to move away from the hawker dragonflies and onto the chasers. And the first chaser we're going to look at is the very appropriately named broad-bodied chaser. Now, in this example, this is a beautiful female who exhibits this lovely golden yellow coloration. Absolutely stunning. Interestingly, this is also a female egg laying at this time, but she's displaying the blue coloration that is more typical of the males. That is likely down to something called pruinescence, indicating she's quite an elderly individual. Now, this is a more typical example of the stunning blue male. Of course, they are very short-bodied and very broad, as their name suggests. Now, they're also rather early flying, so actually you might see these dragonflies sometimes from early spring, usually from around about April. Now, they are a pond-loving species. They prefer smaller bodies of standing water, and they're also very territorial. So you'll often see the males perched on emergent vegetation, flying out to attack any would-be intruders or perhaps to pursue a female. Now, also, they're one of the first to colonize new ponds. So if you have a pond in your garden, it is very likely that you will attract these stunning broad-bodied chasers. Now, they have these very dark patches at the bases of their wings, and this is a really distinctive characteristic even amongst the chaser dragonflies. Now, of course, as I mentioned, the males have this beautiful blue abdomen, and the females, as per the video, have that lovely golden yellow abdomen. Now, I should say that their flight is rather rapid and it is also somewhat erratic. So you might find that broad-bodied chasers can be quite difficult to keep track of. But if you stick with it, be patient, the chances are they'll return back to a regular perching spot. Right, let's move on to the next of our chaser species, which is the four-spotted chaser. So the four-spotted chaser is remarkably different from the broad-bodied chaser in appearance. It has this very long, pointed, tapering abdomen in stark contrast to the width of its broad-bodied cousin. Now, it's also rather dull and uniform brown in coloration. It's really not the most exotic of dragonflies. Now, this species also favours smaller, slower flowing water bodies. Now, you'll probably see it in the largest numbers upon acidic heathland. It really seems to like these acid pools. Now, again, like the broad-bodied chaser, this is a species that you'll often see perched on marginal vegetation, and it often returns to the same perch. So it really is a species that I guarantee you'll get a really good look at. Now, again, as with the broad-bodied chaser, the males are very, very territorial. So often you'll see them perched and then they'll fly out to intercept likely intruders, but of course also to pursue females before returning to the same perching spot. Now, of course, the reason for their naming stems from these 4 additional spots on the wings. Now, whatever you do, don't confuse these with the normal wing spots, the pterostigma, which are the spots located closer to the edges of the wings. Now, of course, it is a fairly brown dragonfly as a whole, and you can really see here that the thorax and the eyes are distinctly brown. Now, as I mentioned in the videos, it has this narrow tapering abdomen, which really helps to separate it from the broad-bodied chaser. Now, the wings are actually flushed yellow at the base. They're not all dark at the bases, as in the broad-bodied chaser. So that's a useful characteristic to help split the 2 dragonflies. Okay, so now we're going to move away from the chaser dragonflies and onto the skimmers. So we're just going to cover one of our 2 skimmer species, the so-called black-tailed skimmer. Now, this dragonfly is a species that is increasing its range northwards. It's relatively common in the south of England, so it is one that you'll expect to see regularly in Sussex. Now, it's a species that where you see one black-tailed skimmer, you tend to see a lot. They can really be quite common at a number of sites. Now, if you happen to see a dragonfly that looks largely blue and it's skimming low and fast over the water, it's very likely that it's going to be a male black-tailed skimmer. Now, they tend to favour lakes and larger water bodies as a whole. Now, also there are dragonfly that tend to sunbathe out in the open, so you'll often see them perched on bare ground, on soil or gravel or sand, or perhaps on dead wood. So sometimes they offer you a really, really good view. Now they have these greenish blue eyes that are very distinctive, and the male has this very diagnostic powder blue abdomen with a black tip. Now I should say that the female is rather different, but I'll be covering her on the next slide. Now they also have these very dark, even black wing spots, very, very distinctive. They also have a yellow frontal wing vein, a yellow costa, but I do admit that is quite difficult to see in this image. So now I'd like to take the opportunity to look at a few individuals of the last 3 species we've covered and look at some of their most defining characteristics. So let's check out a female broad-bodied chaser, a 4-spotted chaser, and a female black-tailed skimmer. Now, of course, in the broad-bodied chaser, they have these very dark wing bases, but the most prominent feature is that really wide abdomen. You really can't confuse that for any other. Now, the 4-spotted chaser, of course, has a much narrower tapering abdomen, but it has those 4 really diagnostic wing spots that you really can't confuse for any other species. Now, the black-tailed skimmer is similar in coloration, but she has this very, very distinctive black ladder pattern all the way down her abdomen. So hopefully those points will help you to identify these dragonflies, particularly if you see them at a distance. Okay, so the last of the dragonfly groups I'd like to look at are the darters, and we're just going to look at the 2 darter species, beginning with the common darter. So this is a really attractive, colourful species, and it really is the commonest British lowland dragonfly species. Now, the common darter also has a really extended flight season. So while you might see these dragonflies flying from early spring, they may still be on the wing close to Christmas. Quite phenomenal. Now, they very much live up to their name. They love a prominent perch, but they'll often dart away from that perch and return to the very same spot. Now, this will often give you a really good opportunity for a close look. And if you approach quietly and you don't cast your shadow over them, then you generally will be able to get really near. Now, the territorial males, they often perch on the ground or very close to it. They have this really interesting characteristic where they seem to cock their head at you when you're looking at them, which does sort of humanise them somewhat. Now, you'll often find these dragonflies well away from water. You'll often see them around hedgerows and woodland edges as well. Now, the common darter actually has these really distinct yellow stripes on its legs. Sometimes this can be difficult to see, but if you have a pair of binoculars, then I would definitely recommend trying to look at the legs. Now, they also have these two really distinct yellow patches on the side of their thorax. This is very important, and it's actually only shown by the common darter of the two more common species. Now, these yellow patches are divided by a small outlined rectangle. Now, this might sound quite precise, but actually it's really important in splitting this dragonfly from the next species, which is the rather amusingly named Ruddy Data. So the Ruddy Data is generally a little bit less common than the common darter, and you can see that the thorax is much browner in coloration as a whole. So that really helps to split the males of the two species. Now, the Ruddy Darter has a shorter flight season, so it tends to fly from very slightly later than the common darter, but it will typically stop flying in late autumn as opposed to flying into early winter. Now, the Ruddy Darter has a much higher level of tolerance for acidic waters in comparison to the common darter, and it also has a rather more blood red coloration in the case of the male. Now, this really extends right the way onto the face, and of course it covers the whole of the thorax, which is divided by those yellow panels on the common darter. Now, the legs are all black on the Ruddy Darter. They have no evidence of the striping that the common darter has. Now, the abdomen as well, it's actually more tapered than that of the common darter, but I really wouldn't use this as a defining characteristic because individual dragonflies do seem to show quite a lot of variation. Now, they also have these black markings on the side of their face, but this can be very difficult to see unless you're particularly close to the dragonfly. So binoculars or a camera definitely will help you with this characteristic. Now, the last feature that I would mention is they have this inverted black T on the top of the thorax. This is quite diagnostic in the Ruddy Darter and is a very useful tool in splitting the two species. Now, I should say that was the male darters, but the female darters and the immatures, they offer a totally different identification challenge. Now, unfortunately, most of them are golden yellow-brown in coloration, but they can all look very, very similar. So you really do need to look at some of those defining characteristics. Now, in the case of this example, we can see the yellow stripes on the legs, so we therefore know this is a female common darter. And of course, those panels on the side of the thorax are also very distinctive. What I would recommend is taking digital images of as many different features as you possibly can, because it often will be a combination of these things that help you to determine just what it is that you're looking at. Okay, everybody, well, that concludes part 3, where we've looked at just under half of the dragonfly species to be found in Sussex. Join me again in part 4, where we'll be looking at some of the damselfly species that you can also find in our wonderful county.